Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Monday, April 24th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 132 days. The game against Michigan in 216 days. Today we are starting our series of post-spring, position-by-position recaps, where things stand, where things maybe have changed over the last couple months, and where the Buckeyes will be headed coming into the 2023 season. But before we do this positional preview, we're going to do a little transfer portal news, because this may be relevant to the segment we're going to do a little bit later. Right now, we're going to be talking about cornerbacks for Ohio State, and there was some interesting news that came on Friday when Lorenzo Styles, who was a wide receiver at Notre Dame and before switching to corner very recently this spring, put his name in the transfer portal the day before Notre Dame's spring game. So, why is this relevant to the Ohio State cornerback preview? Well, Kevin Noon of BuckeyeHuddle.com is here, and I suspect Kevin Noon may have an idea why this might be. We might be linking these two things. Kevin, what are you seeing? What are you hearing about Lorenzo Styles Jr. and Ohio State potentially?
Yeah, that's right. Lorenzo Styles Jr., the older brother of Sonny Styles, the son and name of a former Buckeye who played in the early 90s, Lorenzo Styles Sr. We didn't know he was going to be a senior at that point, went on to have a multi-year NFL career. Lorenzo Styles Jr. Was recruited by Ohio State at defensive back, really wanted to stay on offense, played wide receiver, ended up signing with Notre Dame. 2-year career there, 60 catches or so between 2 seasons, a few touchdowns. Notre Dame asked him to move to defense. Okay, I'll move to defense, and within a week he's in the portal. You got to like Ohio State's chances here of getting him to come home, have the Styles family be able to watch both of their sons play on the same team. It would be interesting for the Notre Dame game. Javonte Jean-Baptiste goes to Notre Dame, and if Ohio State ends up getting Lorenzo Styles Jr., you'll have a nice little flip-flop with that situation. But he would figure out to be a corner, 6'1", 190-ish type of guy, that big type of corner that Ohio State really likes. Probably somebody that I wouldn't expect to immediately get into the mix as somebody who's been on offense for a couple years, but somebody that is way too talented to pass up on, especially somebody from your backyard.
So as of right now, he has not made a decision. Clay Hall from ABC6 had talked to the Styles family, said sounded like he may be making potentially a few visits or something before he makes a final decision. So just something to keep an eye on. If he does end up at Ohio State, as Kevin said, I certainly would not expect him to be in the mix for a starting position this fall for, I guess several reasons. One is he has not really played defensive back at all since, at any point in his college career. And number two is Ohio State looking pretty good at the corner position this year. So I think coming out of the spring, Kevin, the cornerback position might be the area where my expectations for 2023 have been upgraded the most since the start of the spring. And I think a lot of that starts with Denzel Burke, who had a solid freshman year, kind of out of nowhere, an okay sophomore year, but just everything you're seeing, everything you're hearing about Denzel Burke, it sure seems like he's sort of setting himself up to be a real difference maker this fall.
Yeah, you have that sophomore slump, and people are ready to write you off, and Denzel Burke took it to heart and really had to learn, as they always say about cornerback, you have to have a short memory. And while we would never ask him directly if he was reading his own press clippings or things of that nature, you sit there and you have kind of a bad start to the season, and then it just builds and builds and builds, and you're part of a room that has injury after injury, and it's not deep to begin with in 2022. It's a new year. Denzel Burke really feels that he was able to grow from that situation. And from everything we saw in the spring, he looks like the Denzel Burke of old. And by that, I mean 2 years ago rather than last year. So Ohio State's corner room, as you kind of go through it, has a lot of experience. When you look at the 4 players that I would have in the 2 deep, all of them have starting experience, with Jair Brown being the one maybe with the least. But, Ohio State certainly has the experience in that room, and will have some bodies once you figure the true freshmen in. I think that the corner room is really going to be solid and special for them. Will it be BIA special? Time will tell.
Yeah, it feels like they maybe have the pieces to have a first-round corner or two coming out of that room for the first time in a few years. It has sort of felt like they are kind of coasting on the BIA reputation from the Jeff Okudah and Damon Arnett and that whole era of corners where they were getting first-round picks just about every year. Now it feels like maybe you've got, Burke is, could he be a first-round guy? Jordan Hancock came in with the ranking that would sort of suggest that he might be on that track, and then just last year just could not stay healthy. He started the year hurt, missed a bunch of time in fall camp, came back, was never really 100%, just had a nagging hamstring injury for a huge chunk of that season, and just never quite looked right. This spring, we saw probably more spring practices than we've seen in, at least 4 or 5 years. And man, the cornerbacks on the whole looked good. Jordan Hancock looked good. Jordan Hancock looked like, okay, now he finally looks healthy. Now he's finally looking like what you would sort of expect based on those recruiting rankings a few years back.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there were a couple of times that even though I knew Jordan Hancock was wearing number 7, I had to kind of look and it just was like, all right, this looks like a new guy out there. I mean, he, healthy, as healthy as you're going to be, honestly, coming in, through spring and maybe in the summer. And then once you get into fall camp, things kind of happen sometimes. But, Hancock was never able to really get into any sort of a rhythm last year when Ohio State most needed it. You see him out there in spring ball. He was really sharp. I mean, he, still has a good amount of physicality in what it is that he does. I mean, he's another old head in that room right now. I mean, when you're sitting there looking at a room where guys that are like true juniors, more or less, are your leaders. And, I think with the tandem of Burke and Hancock, that's what it ends up being as your starters. And I think we could see, a little bit of rotation based on just kind of what's going on. And sometimes you just have to ride the hot hand, too, of guys that are just getting it done. But I think that the 10-7 split right there is going to be really good for Ohio State and pose to be a gutter ball for opposing passing offenses.
Oh, man, that was a Tony Gerdeman-worthy turn of phrase there. I'm very impressed in this case. Sorry to confuse everyone. In this case, I'm comparing someone to Tony in a positive way. So a little different than how we typically do it on this show, but that is well done. I am going to have to steal that at some point and not credit you. I can't wait. All right. So the Buckeyes, you mentioned earlier, hey, potentially a little bit of a, swap of Lorenzo Styles and Javonte Jean-Baptiste between Notre Dame and Ohio State if they do end up with Styles. They Buckeyes also had a little bit of a cornerback trade with the SEC. Jalen Johnson goes down to LSU, following in the footsteps of Sevyn Banks a year earlier. And back from the SEC comes Davison Igbinosun from Ole Miss. He started 9 games, I believe, to start his true freshman season at Ole Miss, and started, I think, the bowl game as well. So he ended up at 10 starts as a true freshman at Ole Miss. And then it hit the transfer portal, came up, and he was someone who, just the first day of spring ball that we got to watch, he really just physically jumped out at you. And then as you watched him practice all spring, it was like, oh yeah, this guy can play. This guy is going to play this fall for the Buckeyes.
Yeah, you have to wonder how a Jersey guy gets away from the Big Ten. I mean, Ohio State recruits well out there. Penn State does. I mean, was in, kind of in the Rutgers backyard, and he goes to Oxford to play for Ole Miss. Obviously has a good year to be able to start and do what if it's 10 games. Slowed down a little bit toward the end of the regular season. Had to platoon a little bit more, but then getting into the bowl game, just big guy. 6'2" corner. You see him out there wearing 20, which is a number that Sonny Styles was wearing last year. And, the first roster of the spring is not always the most up-to-date one, and we're all kind of looking at 20 out there, and then we're kind of looking at the roster, and then we're looking at each other, and it's like, I mean, sort of looks like Sonny, but it's not Sonny, and no, it's Davison, and I think it's going to be difficult to keep him off the field. I don't think that any of these guys figure into moving into a nickel role when, Ohio State opts to put another corner out there versus another safety. But I think that he's somebody that's going to see a good amount of playing time. Is he going to be able to overtake Burke or Hancock? I don't know, but I think that again, as I had mentioned earlier, riding the hot hand, and I think that that Davison is somebody that could have a hot hand and force his way into that starting lineup.
And we have not necessarily seen them do the 3 cornerback rotation as consistently as they used to. It kind of feels like maybe you get back into something like that if they feel like he's not too much of a drop-off from Hancock and Burke. You might see that. You mentioned also the nickel position, and that's something that we saw Jair Brown. He got at least one start last year against Wisconsin, just out of sheer desperation. You threw a true freshman in there, and he did pretty well. He looked decent last fall, looked good again this spring. We have seen them working him outside. We have seen them working him in the slot in that sort of nickel spot. He's someone who, again, I don't know that he's starting this year, but he feels like someone who is not going to get more than just garbage time snaps this year. It feels like he's, whether it's at the backup at nickel or just the 4th corner, he's probably playing first half snaps at some point this year too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you look at the situation, Burke and Hancock are both juniors, so you could have a couple of corners just disappear on you at the end of the 23 season. So you better make sure that you have guys like Jair Brown and some of these younger guys getting these meaningful reps. It's one thing at quarterback, and it's like, well, these guys, we're trying to get out there and win games and do this and do that, but you don't want to be in a situation of where you're having to break in a couple of corners that have little to no experience. Unfortunately for Ohio State, these guys all have that experience. You wouldn't want to slow Jair Brown's development down by holding him off the field or whatever. I mean, he is kind of that, maybe that 4th corner in terms of on your 2 deep, but you sit there and you look at the nickel position, and that might be something that fits him well. So I'll be interested to see how they use them. I mean, a lot of people have certainly wanted to kind of get into the minds of Perry Eliano and Tim Walton and how they develop guys and what kind of the view is of how they want to rotate them. So all of that's certainly going to be up for grabs at that point, and it'll be something to keep an eye on.
And then the other second-year guy, Davison Igbinosun, a second-year guy, even though it's his first year at Ohio State. Jair Brown, a second-year guy. And then the other second-year guy is Ryan Turner, and he's someone who feels like he's probably 5th. I think we're kind of more or less going down the depth chart here. But he's someone who you've seen make some plays, and he had a sack at one point last year. He's, is not probably quite as likely to see meaningful snaps this year if everyone's still healthy. But he's someone who, again, we saw him work a little bit at nickel this spring. We saw him work outside this spring. And, he seems like he's sort of on track to, even if he's not a starter this year, which I certainly don't expect, he's certainly on track to be a contributor in some form this year. And then, again, if you lose a guy or two next year, then he bumps right up the depth chart, and all of a sudden, boom, you're in that, at least in the fight for a spot in the rotation.
Yeah, a lot of people were concerned if Ryan Turner was going to be somebody that was going to stick, but he came out and really impressed me this spring and showed that he's developed from year 1 to year 2 and was out there making some plays and doing things. And again, you don't want to speak things into existence, but Ohio State certainly needed to use almost every healthy body they had in that cornerback room last year, and Ryan Turner better be ready to go. And from what I've seen in terms of one team's wearing scarlet and one team's wearing white, and they all come from the same playbook. I mean, you have to temper those expectations a little bit. But I think that he's somebody who's kind of turned a corner. And, it's from getting from year 1 to year 2, that may be one of the spots where you see the most development when it comes to these players. And Turner is somebody that has done that both at corner and then again, as you threw him into the nickel mix. I think that's something important too, with having Jair Brown and Ryan Turner both in there, potentially being that 3rd corner on the field when they go 3 corners, 2 safeties rather than the other way around.
And then the last guy who was there this spring was the highest rated of the early enrollees. That is cornerback Jermaine Matthews. He went through spring ball, did not lose his black stripe, but he's someone we saw out there. This is a spot where it is very rare to see someone started as a freshman, Denzel Burke did it a couple of years ago, but it's unusual for that to happen. This is a spot where you typically need a year or so to develop before you're really ready to fight for a starting position. It feels like that's where Jermaine Matthews is coming out of spring. Calvin Simpson-Hunt will be there coming up a little later on this summer. And then, will they add Lorenzo Styles? That's kind of the interesting question. As Kevin mentioned earlier, I don't think he's in the, certainly not going to be in the starting mix this year. But if you lose Denzel, Burke, and Jordan Hancock, then if they do end up with Lorenzo Styles, you've got Davison Igbinosun, you got Jair Brown, you got Lorenzo Styles, Ryan Turner, Jermaine Matthews, Calvin Simpson-Hunt, all as returning corners next year. And then you've got, some real depth there. And that is a luxury they have not necessarily always had over the last few years. And with as many guys as they've lost to the transfer portal, it is frankly remarkable that they could have that many returning guys potentially with experience in that corner room next year. So that is the corner position. Kevin, I guess my last question for you is, was there a position on the field that jumped and as much in your mind in terms of where they were going into the spring versus where they are coming out of the spring in terms of what they could be now this year? Was corner the position where you saw maybe the biggest jump this spring?
I think so, because truth be told, coming out of spring, I don't think there were a lot of questions on the offensive side except for O-line, and I think the messaging has been pretty steady that it's still a work in progress, and they're certainly not there yet. So then you move to defense, and linebackers pretty locked down with Chambers and Eichenberg. I mean, we certainly saw some good things from some young guys out there, C.J. Hicks, Cody Simon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of really get into this. You get into the secondary, and I think corner was the biggest question marks going in, even with Burke and Hancock being in the mix. I mean, just how were they going to respond coming off of a challenging year for each of them for a little bit of different reasons for one to the other. But it's not a position now, and I certainly have a lot of friends that are the highly reactionary variety of Buckeye fans, and they've all told me at length that they feel pretty comfortable at corner. So that is my barometer for how Buckeye Nation is feeling at this point, is if my extremely nervous and touchy Buckeye friends are feeling good about a position, I think I should too.
Yeah, it does feel like Ohio State fans should be feeling better about the corner position after last season. Last season was an unusual mixture of injuries. You don't normally see that kind of just the frequency and the severity of injuries that they were suffering in that room. So to go from just an absolute mash unit and just constant shuffling of guys to potentially a pretty solid and deep unit, that would be a pretty big improvement. And yes, I know there's the I'm going to need to see it first section of the Ohio State fan base, and that's fine too. We will all get a chance to see it and find out if Kevin and I are right about this, or if the Eeyore segment is going to be right. We'll find out. We'll all find out together this fall. But it does look pretty encouraging, I would say, coming out of the spring for the Buckeyes at the corner position. How is it looking at everywhere else? Well, we're going to be looking at a bunch of those other positions in the coming days and weeks on this show. We're going to go just sort of position group by position group. We'll probably go offense and defense and alternate and all that kind of stuff. For the next couple weeks, we'll be talking a bunch of recruiting too. We got NFL draft coming up this week. There's a lot of fun stuff to talk about right now. And we're going to talk about all of it at BuckeyeHuddle.com on the Huddle board. Our fantastic team of insiders breaking down the team and recruiting and X's and O's and scheme and all that great stuff. Lots of conversations. Mark Giffler does his Tuesday chat, all-day chat there. Lots of great stuff, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.